So dear guests, I hope, well, I did enjoy the first course, and I hope you did as well. The view over Düsseldorf is quite seductive, although you can't see very much now yet. But the real highlight of the evening is yet to come, the keynote speech. For the ones of you who have attended previous dinners, you know that we are always seeking for a high-level speaker, and I must say we've been quite fortunate with this. And when we started planning for this year's dinner, we didn't have to think very much who we want to have to speak. Jean-Luc and I had the chance to hear a great speech of Inga Beale a few years ago at the Stonewall Conference in London. And knowing how inspirational our speaker is, I feel, and I must say it again, very honored that Inga Beale accepted our invitation and took the time to be with us this evening. Inga's career is known for many firsts. In 2014, she became the first woman to be appointed as Chief Executive Officer of the 330-year-old Lloyd's of London insurance market. In 2015, Inga Beale was named the world's most inspiring LGBT business executive by Outstanding, as the first woman ever at the top of the annual list. She's one of the few openly bisexual business leaders and the first to top the ranking. During her career as CEO of Lloyd's, Inga moved the institution into the 21st century, not only by introducing technology into the market, but also by changing its traditional culture to become more and more diverse, open and inclusive, particularly for LGBTIQ talents. Under Inga's leadership at Lloyd's, the market introduced targets for equal gender representation in senior leadership, provided training to staff on topics like unconscious bias and inclusive hiring, and encouraged employee resource groups to form, such as PROUT at Lloyd's, the internal LGBTIQ employee resource group. With Inga's support and sponsorship, the market also launched a diversity and inclusion charter under Inclusion at Lloyd's, where firms could sign up and commit to goals like championing diversity and inclusion in the organization and being accountable for creating positive change. Companies would then receive guidance on how to effectively work towards diversity and inclusion practices. Her own experiences becoming a role model for the LGBT+ community opened up conversations in the workplace, further so that people felt they could come to work as who they are instead of who they thought they had to be. Inga Beale was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2017 for services to the economy. She's currently on the London Mayor's Business Advisory Board and a member of the London First Board. Her philanthropic interests include being the patron of Ensuring Women's Future, a member of Stonewall's Development Council, and on the Pitt Rivers Museum Advisory Board at Oxford University. Dear Inga, to quote you, one of the most important qualities of a successful leader is to listen and to learn from others. By this example, I'm happy to invite you to stage, giving us the opportunity to listen and to learn from one of the best.
Thank you. Well, you're from a town full of gays, and we hope you all die of AIDS. That was one of the chants sung by away football fans visiting Brighton, a club in the south of England, in the 2013-14 Football Championship. It was just one of the many homophobic chants that Brighton supporters included in a dossier when they reported, documenting the abuse that Brighton fans had had throughout that football season. Banter. We hear that word a lot in English. It's a sort of defense when people say things that they shouldn't. The definition of banter is the playful and friendly exchange of teasing remarks. To some attending that football match, that's exactly what they thought it was, a bit of banter. According to one of the spokespeople for Brighton Supporters Club, there were stewards, those managing the crowds. There were police who even found that banter funny. To other fans in that stadium, it was intimidating, offensive, and put them off watching the game that they loved. Now, for those of you who don't know, Brighton is a seaside town that is famous for being one of the most gay-friendly and gay-populated towns in the UK. And that was why the visiting football supporters composed this very special chant. Now, that was 5 years ago. So, of course, things have changed since then, right? Go onto the internet and Google Brighton homophobia football. And I'm afraid the same thing happened earlier this month. It was another visiting team this year, but the same thing happened. And that was in the same week that referees suspended a football match in France because of a homophobic banner. Now, I don't want to overstate the problem. Homophobia in sport, of course, is perpetuated by a minority, albeit a vile, nasty minority, and possibly some of the same minority that are out there who loudly sing the racist chants and shout the racist comments. But the vast majority of spectators, of course, are interested in the contest. They're interested in the sport itself, not whether the contestants or players are gay, not interested in the colour of their skin. They want to enjoy the sport. And yet, plainly, the problem still exists. Now, I'm on the Development Council of Stonewall, as Albert said, a great charity that celebrates its 30th year this year. It's been campaigning and lobbying for equality for 3 decades. It collects lots of data, and as sports lovers love statistics, here are some of the latest data across the UK around sport. 7 in 10 football fans who've attended a match have heard or witnessed homophobia in the stadium. 70%. 1 in 10 LGBT people who attended a live sporting event in the last year experienced discrimination because of their sexual orientation or their gender or their gender identity. 66%, that's 2/3 of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people feel that there are problems with homophobia and transphobia in sport, and this is acting as a complete barrier to why LGBT people don't want to take part. And perhaps it's most telling that in the UK Premiership football, there is not one out player, not one male current player in the Premiership football who's out. Although 2 months ago, it was reported that one of them was going to come out. And what happened? The club officials said no. Too risky. Now, we know statistically that that can't be right. We know it. But of course, emotionally, it might be right. Because why would you come out? Why would you go through a potential lot of pain for little or no gain? We should all be ashamed of this in this day and age. We're in 2019, not 1919. But I'm afraid people in many areas feel they can't be themselves. Now you might say, why is this woman going on about sport? It's so much better in the business world. Well, I've got some Stonewall stats from business now. More than a third of LGBT staff have hidden that they're LGBT at work for fear of discrimination. 35%. 10% of all Black, Asian and minority ethnic LGBT employees have been physically attacked by customers or colleagues in the last year. Almost 1 in 5 LGBT staff have been the target of negative comments or something happening negatively to them at work from their colleagues because they're LGBT. 18% of our workforce. And for those of us in leadership positions, which is all of us gathered here today, I am very concerned about the lack of a safe and open environment, because it doesn't seem to be what we're creating, because 1 in 8 of the LGBT community wouldn't feel confident even reporting those homophobic or transphobic attacks on them. And that's a very sad statistic. And it is so incumbent on all of us leaders, be they in sport, business, or anywhere. We have to create the environments where people feel supported when they bring their whole selves to work. So I hope later on we get to talk about the things that some of us have done and perhaps what we can do to promote inclusion and acceptance in the workplace. But first, I'd just like to give you a little insight into some of my journey and how not being inclusive can impact an organisation. I got to the top of the insurance profession now. Lloyd's of London is totally unique. It's centuries old, and it's known in almost every country in the world. But I nearly left insurance in my 20s, after an incident at my employer. Now, I was working for one of the leading UK insurers, and they still are one of the leading insurers. But they held, or we, I should have said at that time, held a series of cocktail parties to celebrate the World Cricket Championship. I know that's not a popular sport in Germany, but for the Brits, it's a popular sport. And these championships were taking place in the Caribbean. So we decided to have a Caribbean flavour. And we had some goat curry and some red stripe lager. And we also had some Jamaican tourist board posters. And we put them all around to give a Caribbean feeling. Now, this was the 80s, and the posters were basically photographs of women, either near naked or wearing wet t-shirts. Now, when I complained to my manager a few weeks later, after the parties were over, that the pictures were still up, he said, "Oh, how could we have been so insensitive? I'll do something about that." The next morning I arrived at work. The posters were down, but my desk and my chair was wrapped up in the posters. So I decided to walk out of the office. I was so mad. I'd been working in insurance for about 8 years by then. I walked out and I went home completely disillusioned with the whole industry and gave up my job, promised myself I would never work in insurance again. I got on a plane and left the whole industry behind me. Well, years later, obviously, I came back to insurance, and that's another story that could take a an evening, but I'm not going to share that tonight. But I did go back despite feeling completely excluded at work. But then when I came back, I had another sort of chapter in my life, and I began hiding something at work because I started to have relationships with women. And I was in a long-term relationship with a woman, but I concealed my personal life, as so many people have done and perhaps still do. And I excluded myself from the ordinary office chatter and conversations. I prevented my partner from phoning me at work. Those were the days that we didn't really have mobile phones. This was in early 90s by this time. We didn't have direct telephone lines, so she did not or wasn't allowed by me to phone me at work. And I felt very fearful about coming out, so I was in the closet for many years. I finally came out in 2008, and that was because I went to a new job and I decided I was sick, absolutely sick of living a double life. And I was sick of the way I'd been treating my partner, who later on became my wife. So I decided when I went for this new role, I would tell the CEO who's hiring me that I was in a lesbian relationship. And of course he was fine. But what I found then, I spoke to my team, I arrived, I was the manager, I spoke to my team, I told them about my personal circumstances. I was in Switzerland at the time, and I felt some slight uneasiness in the group. Nobody said anything. And in the 4 years I worked at that company, I had one of my direct reports once ask me about my partner at home. Only once. Because I understood at that, I could feel that they weren't feeling comfortable in even talking to me about it, even though I was out. But of course, personally, I did feel quite liberated. Finally, I could be myself at work, and I could bring my whole self to work. And the reason I say that is because I know from personal experience, and each and every one of us will have our own personal experience of not wanting to be out about something. But if you've lived in the closet for so many years and you come out, you feel liberated. It's a whole weight off your shoulder. Now that cannot be healthy for any organization when they've got people being unproductive, worrying about this, taking themselves out of situations, not talking as openly as they should be able to. We're never going to get the best out of our people if they're living with some sort of fear. So that creating that inclusive workplace culture has become very important to me. And I believe it should be a business priority for every CEO, for every leader, every manager of people, almost every single person in an organization. But how do we do it? How do we make that change happen? How do we get our cultures to be inclusive? Now, when I did take that role as the first ever female CEO of Lloyd's, I faced a challenge. I inherited a very old institution, steeped in charming or perhaps outdated traditions, depending on your point of view, but certainly an institution that was anything but diverse. A stroll through the market, and it's a physical market with thousands of people trading together every day in a physical space. A stroll through there will show you that there are only a handful of women in that room, and very, very few who are non-white. It was clear to me that this organization needed a bit of a shake-up. It was facing some serious challenges. So I didn't know what to do because I wasn't brought in to make that culture change. I was brought in to introduce technology. But I realized there was no way we were going to embrace new ways of working, or even have the skills and talent if we didn't appeal to different types of people. So I started talking about this at town halls. Didn't really know, I didn't have a big master plan. I just started talking about it. I started using words like gay and lesbian and bisexual. I started talking about why am I looking out on a sea of only white faces. I started talking about the lack of women in senior leadership roles. Now, first of all, particularly when I started using words like lesbian, there were lots of giggles. Nervous, embarrassed giggles, and heads went down a little bit. But I didn't stop. I kept using these words. And then employees started to use them. And employees felt empowered. And they felt empowered to start their own networks. That's why Pride at Lloyd's was born. I didn't go and tell them to do it. They did it themselves. And I do remember that evening we launched Pride at Lloyd's. It was a celebration. There were some speeches, but it was a celebration. And one of the men who was there, an older guy who'd been working at Lloyd's for about 30 years, he came up to me and he had a slight tear in his eye. And he said, "Inga, thank you. I never thought I would see this happen in Lloyd's. I never thought I would see this day. This is quite amazing." And I thought he was going to tell me he'd come out at work and now he was confident enough. But he told me that his son was gay. And he had never been able to talk at work about his son being gay. He was fearful of that banter, or maybe something even worse. So he hid the fact his son was gay, and he talked about his son as though he was in a heterosexual relationship. Now, I was delighted that he had his coming out story about his son, but I was also very sad. This was in 2014, 5 years ago. It wasn't a long time ago. So when I think about the work we have to do to make our workplaces inclusive, there's a lot of work still to do. Now, most of you here, all of you here, you're bought into this. You know the importance. We've got to start talking to the people who don't get it, the cynical people who don't want to get it. And that's why we started the Dive In Festival. Now, the Dive In Festival, I was so nervous when we launched it. We did this in 2015, and I felt that we needed to start engaging people in the conversation who hadn't been in the conversation before, because we were talking to ourselves. And this, we decided to have in a series of events just in London over 3 days. And we wanted it to be a celebration, but we wanted to talk about serious issues. And we had about 40 events covering all sorts of different aspects of diversity. And we specifically had some exclusive events for CEOs. So we got the CEOs in a room, we talked about it. And I had some insights that I had never even thought about, because of course I was the only female CEO, and they were all men. So I was and none of them were gay men, or as far as I know, because they weren't out. But anyway, now it's going into its 5th year. And what happened after that first one was it unleashed a sort of virus into the employee bases of all of these people. There were about 34,000 people who worked just around Lloyd's. It unleashed this, and this was now going to be unstoppable. And before the week ended, there were calls for it to happen again the following year. So now it's in its 5th year. And we even had the launch event hosted by the Bank of England last week. And guess what happens when an organisation like the Bank of England, the most senior financial services regulatory body in the country. Guess what happens when they send out the guest list to the CEOs? Guess who comes? The CEOs. And I was absolutely thrilled when I heard this was going to happen, because this means this is not going to stop. This year, this is a sector-wide, so this is all insurance firms together now involved in it. And this year, it's going to over 30 countries, over 60 cities in those countries. 10,000 plus people will be physically attending these events. And we've got events in Nigeria. We've got events in Indonesia. We've got events in Saudi Arabia. So there's something happening here about collaboration, sharing best practice, understanding and listening, understanding from each other and listening to each other about how we can make a difference. Because the thing I am so caught up on about this inclusion topic is that I believe it's much broader than the workplace. I believe it goes into the core of society. When I think about Brexit and the UK, I think, what happened? Why did we disengage with the population so badly? Why did they not trust anybody anymore? They don't trust the government. They don't trust business. They certainly don't trust media. They hardly trust NGOs now. The charities themselves have got themselves into bother, haven't they? I think the academics are still up there as the shining examples of people you can trust. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and this inclusion to me goes way beyond our workplaces. It goes into society. They're not respected, they're not included, their voice isn't heard, they're not having an impact, they're not having a say on their future, and they want a say on that future. The gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger. When you have 70% of the world's population only having 3% of the wealth, what do you think's going to happen? We are not living in a very inclusive world. So there is a much deeper reason behind why we need to keep pushing this agenda, keep talking about it, each and every one of us. We all have a role to play, because businesses are going to have to lead the way for society. I believe it. Remember, of course, we're employing a lot of these people in our firms. So if we can show and be examples, it can spread out further into society. And in 5 years' time, we won't be having homophobic chants at football games. Each and every one of us can play our part. And I would just urge all of you to try and make a difference. I'm not an expert in this. I just have been learning over each of the years I've been working, 37 years I've been working in insurance now. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to use my own experiences, share them with others to say, how can we do this differently? How can we make this world a better place? And I would just urge all of you to do something to make a difference, because it's much better to have tried to do something than to end up having never done anything at all. So thank you very much for listening to my little bit of a plea. I will continue to be as outspoken as I can. It needs courage. Every day it takes a little bit of courage to challenge somebody, to say something that makes something change for the better. It takes courage. And we don't always have that courage. And I don't always have that courage, and some days I choose not to speak out. But most of the time, when I'm asked to come to a conversation like this tonight, it gives me energy to carry on talking about it. And I hope tonight will energize everybody here to go out and do something. So thank you for listening.
I'm speechless. Thank you very much, Inga. The floor is yours now. If you have any questions to Inga, raise your hand and I'll give you the mic.
Thank you very much, Inga, for your inspiring speech. You mentioned business, you mentioned sports, you did not mention politicians. When I think of Donald Trump, when I think of Putin, when I think of Viktor Orban and other countries, I see a very strong movement in the complete other direction. Has this an influence? Can this stop this movement, or is this just an accident?
Well, I believe the route, we've got to this stage where we've got these extremes and these polarized societies everywhere. So the UK now is completely polarized over Brexit. I had one of my friends from California over at the weekend. She said the US is completely polarized over Trump. We have these really serious situations. And I was actually asked recently to go and speak in Brazil at a big LGBT conference they're hosting there in November. And when I spoke to somebody and I said, do you think I should go? And they said, it's too dangerous. How can you go to this big LGBT conference in Brazil when you've got a leader who's so openly anti the gay community? Now, I was going to go, I can't actually, as it happens, make it. But this is very, very, very worrying. But I do believe that if business starts to talk about these things, we can make a difference. Now, one of the things that I've sensed is happening, and I've noticed it particularly in the US, and it's starting to happen a bit more now, is the employees, of course, are demanding something different, and they're having an impact. So if I think about what happened at Google with the way they treated somebody who left, having been found to have been sexually harassing, or having, found to have done sexual harassment at work, and the employees were going to walk out on Google and say, this isn't good enough the way you're handling this. And Google were forced to change their rules because of their employees. And hopefully that will start to have an impact on the rest of the other big firms. We also have recently in New York the gathering of the business leaders who say there's got to be another way to do capitalism. You've got the rise of the B Team, which is an organization in the US founded by many of the leading CEOs in the world, saying there's got to be another way. We've got Extinction Rebellion talking about climate and really forcing people to take action. There is something happening that I believe will stop some of these politicians from seeing through some of their scary agendas. I do believe that sense will prevail. But it is slightly worrying times, but I know that if we as business can actually speak out more, and business leaders often don't like to. They don't like to, do they? Pre-Brexit, I was speaking out about the need to remain in the EU, but I was very, I was one of very few business leaders who spoke about it. So I was always wanted to interview me on the television all the time because nobody else wanted to speak about it. So it does take some courage, but that's what we need. But I think every single one of you here can do something about that in your own firms. You can talk about it. One of the disappointing things, and I will just give this little bit of feedback about Germany. I did work here many years ago, but I haven't worked here for a long time. But when we launched this dive-in festival and we were going to all these countries like Nigeria, I was struggling to get Germany to host one event. And that was last year. And I spoke to some of the largest firms you have in the insurance space in Germany. They said, it's not on our priority list. We are not going to be part of it. Now, we did manage to have an event last year, and we have one event this year in Cologne, sponsored by a law firm. Not one of the insurers, but sponsored by a law firm. But I tell you, I was a bit confounded when I spoke to these big German firms, and they said it wasn't on their priority list to have diversity and inclusion topic on their priority list. I was really quite surprised. So I can sense there are lots of different things going on in different countries, and countries move at different paces, and you've got all sorts of different priorities in countries. But if we talk about this need for inclusion, I think all businesses have to get on this bandwagon and get on it quickly before most of our countries turn into real polarized societies where you've got people in fear of walking down a street, as is what's happening in some streets now in the UK, all driven around the Brexit issue.
We have another question here in the back.
Yes, thanks Inga for the inspiration. My name is Ben. I started my career in politics and I moved forward to the digital industry. So obviously the insurance industry has a problem with discrimination. That was something I learned tonight. But do you have any insights in which industries this kind of discrimination occurs more often than in others?
I don't know about LGBT specifically, but there's much more data about women. And I guess it's because it's a characteristic that most companies know. And therefore it's been measured for a while. And we've got lots of data on that. I know in the UK, the worst sector is construction. Construction sector, then it's banking, then it's insurance, the worst. Tech in the UK, and I don't know about around the rest of Europe, isn't as bad as financial services. But I think when you go to somewhere like Silicon Valley, I think tech is very bad for women. But I'm also on a distribution list for lesbians who tech. And that's a huge group. And often, and this is why I believe so much in the power of these networks and then bringing people outside of your network into the room, because it's only when you see everyone gather together that you think, wow, there are a lot of people from that community. And when you see these lesbians who get together at their big conference, you'd just be amazed how many thousands and thousands and thousands of them there are. But generally, you don't see them. And we know quite a lot about different behaviours with the genders. So we know why some women opt out, become entrepreneurs, don't want to do with the politics and things like that. But in terms of some of the other communities, we don't have as much data. The LGBT community, we certainly have very, very poor data. When I started at Lloyd's, I think we had less than 10% of the employees, because it's a voluntary element, even wrote down whether they were heterosexual, gay, bisexual, didn't matter. They wouldn't even answer it, less than 10%. Fortunately, that went up to nearly 100% because people realised that we were collecting it for a good reason, because we wanted to understand how the population was made up, how we could do something different for that population, etc. An ethnic background, I think we're certainly in the UK now we're getting a better focus on. But really, I think data-wise, the only one we really are confident about is on the gender side. And we're doing pretty badly at that, generally, overall.
Any other question?
Thanks again, Inga, for this inspiring speech. But my question would be, if you have a second advice for us, what we could do besides talking about it, What would be your second advice?
Well, I'm a bit extreme in this, and it's partly because I was 47 years old and I was having lunch with a female who was leaving a Swiss bank. She worked in finance, and she was exactly the same age as me, and this is why I remember this conversation, how old I was. She said, Inga, I can't cope with this anymore. I just can't cope with this, the behaviours at work, all the subtleties that don't make me feel included. I'm leaving, and I'm going to set up my own business. And I was furious with her, furious. I said, how dare you? I said, if you leave the corporate world, what have we been fighting for? You've got to stay. She was a bit taken aback, but it was an important conversation for me, and then I started to get just a little bit angry. And I looked around, and I went to yet another big gathering of CEOs, and I was the only female around the table, and that's when I said, we've got to set these damn quotas, and we've got to set these targets. And we have to have penalties if people don't meet them, because otherwise we are not going to make the difference we need to make. Now, just a little example. The gender pay gap reporting was made mandatory in the UK last year. Now, I heard just 2 weeks before the official deadline that the very firms, and some of them are represented here tonight, the very firms that had been advising the government on how to construct the gender pay gap reporting, professional services firms, lawyers, they have a bunch of partners. And they decided that even though every company that has more than 250 employees must report the gender pay gap, we don't count our partners as employees. They're equity owners. So we'll exclude all the partners. I heard that 2 weeks before the due date. Fortunately, I had an interview the day I found out with the Financial Times on something else, but I decided to tell the journalist about this, and I said, this is outrageous. I had also learnt that many of the clever banks, with the big earners making the big bonuses, they'd created all these nice subsidiaries with less than 250 employees, and they didn't have to include them either. So I was a bit upset, and I spoke openly, and then fortunately I got it on the radio. Now, there was a partner leading one of the UK professional services firms who contacted me, and he said, Inga, I get it. There were many who were very rude about me, but there was one who said, Inga, I get what you're saying. I'm thinking of including all the partners. The data's going to look much worse. Should I or shouldn't I? I said, do it. Even though your data's going to look worse, at least all the women will feel that you're being transparent and honest. Now, a year later, we've reported the gender pay gap again. Has it moved? It's moved by 0.2%. And many of the firms have got even worse. Do you know why? No repercussions, no penalties, nothing happens. So if we're really going to make a difference, we've got to start having something to aim for, and there have to be penalties if you don't achieve those, whatever they are. We've got to do something about that. And so that is the other thing. And so at Lloyd's, we set gender targets, we set ethnic minority targets, we set LGBT targets, we set age targets, everything we could start to measure. And then the executive bonuses were going to be impacted if they didn't show in their divisions that they were making progress towards them. So that's what we did.
Thank you very much, Inga.